So just quickly 1 minute about, for those who don't know who I am and what my organization represents, quickly, and then I try and touch about the RE development. I've been fortunate to be, working and seeking guidance from Ajay Shankarji, and he has actually, paved the way for the entire, landscape he has covered it. So that makes my task a little bit easier. But I'll talk specifically about renewable energy and storage. What are the interventions which has happened so far, and what are the further changes or interventions which are expected, and which will try and hopefully address some of those challenges as we go along. Also briefly touch upon the new areas that we're talking about, because the 500 gigawatt ambition is not small one, and there are ways in which the new areas that is opening up, offshore wind and repowering, I can try and talk about a little bit. So Idam Infra, what does Idam stands for? Idam, all of us know the Sanskrit word. It stands for it or this, and we are given a twist to say it, this earth at this point in time, and we have consciously designed this logo. We are a decade-old consulting organization working in energy space, but predominantly on the renewable energy with sustainability as an agenda, and our motto is to minimize the to enable the carbon minimal world. That's what we are working with, and our logo actually signifies that the planet Earth at the center, India at the center, because our work predominantly hovers around India, but we have done some work in overseas countries as well. The 5 dots surrounding it basically represent the 5 basic elements of nature: air, fire, water, earth, and space. That's the basic elements of nature, and the fins give it the churning movement to keep it stable and sustainable. So that's the motto with which we try and work, that we need to keep this earth stable and sustainable, and all our activities are focused and centered around that. We are organized in terms of 3 verticals. The core verticals of consulting focus on electricity market and regulatory, industrial decarbonization and energy transition, but we also do work in providing IT solutions, mainly on the energy space and power sector, as well as geospatial data management solutions and services through 2 other separate brands, Guru and Infaji. And we work with a range of clients, both in government sector, private sector, public policy, public sector, regulatory commissions, multilateral donor agencies. And with less than decade-old existence, we have been fortunate to be working with almost all renewable technologies in the country, and not just working, being a pioneer in some of those, bringing renewable energy certificate mechanism in the country, the PAT scheme design part of it, the RPO framework, the feed-in tariff regulations, competitive framework, as well as grid integration, forecasting, scheduling regulations, and now the all new technologies, the new innovations we have been fortunate to be working, and not only in terms of working with the regulators, but also with the private sector to implement them. Now coming to the overall RE landscape, how it has evolved, and thanks to our Indian planners, policymakers and bureaucrats who had thought through about, and then Mr. Shankar is here with us, the Electricity Act 2003, we were just under 2 and 3 gigawatts, and today we are looking at 120 gigawatt, close to that renewable energy capacity, and that has been possible with all those, with the planned arrangement in terms of various policy instruments and regulatory instruments in terms of tariff policy, the RPO mechanism, REC mechanism, and over a period we had actually reached from 2.3 gigawatt to 70 gigawatt in FY18, and last 4-5 years has been in fact stupendous growth. So today we are looking at almost 30% of our renewable, our complete capacity basket of 400 gigawatts, 119 gigawatts from renewable, and solar and wind stands very tall in terms of 61 gigawatts of solar installations and 42 gigawatt plus of wind installations here. We are the 4th largest in terms of wind installations, cumulative installed capacity in the world. That's a global landmark. And solar also moved to the 5th position. So in both these we are in a way closer to the market, both in terms of deployment as well as in terms of technology adoption. Now, how this has been possible? It's been possible with concentrated efforts of across multiple states, multiple RE-rich states. Typically, 6 RE-rich states form more than 75 to 80% of this capacity. And then look at it, these are not mean numbers. These states are actually having almost 18 to 20 gigawatt of installed capacity, and compare it with their peak demand that has been catered, or almost close to the peak demand, the installed capacity base. Although still we are hardly 40 to 50% of their respective installed capacity base in those states is from the renewables, and there is a still vast RE potential in these RE states that needs to be harnessed, and that's where our ambition, which is spelled out by the government and through our international commitments as well as ambitions, to reach a 500 gigawatt by 2030, to have at least 50% of energy basket from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030, reduce CO2 emissions by 1 billion tons, as well as carbon intensity of, our emission intensity of economy should reduce by 45%, and net zero, we just had a discussions earlier. So while we have traversed a good path, the ambition and our aspirations actually are even significant. And it's not that these are just numbers which are thrown in, these are backed up by several important studies, and we have been also party to, in fact, we have been part of some of the studies. And just put it out right from theory to CA studies, just look at in 2020, we were 38 or 36 gigawatt of wind and solar, and now we are aspiring, most of the studies indicate about 140 to 200 gigawatt for wind, and for solar almost reaching up to 280, 250 gigawatt plus of solar. Coupled with the storage, although it mentioned battery storage, but it comprises all sorts of storage one could look at, because different studies has got a different sets of assumptions in looking at the piece. We ourselves did a study along with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory for US Department of State and Ministry of Power and CEA, and looked at this, what is the most optimal capacity expansion mix for India in 2030, and our studies also shows the similar results year on year, and not only the capacity expansion on an annual basis, we had looked at also the dispatch hourly and sub-hourly dispatch simulations, and what is easily possible to absorb, we can, and this is the most optimal capacity mix, solar of 307 gigawatt DC plus 142 gigawatt of wind, 15 gigawatt of other renewable sources, plus energy storage of 4 hour to 6 hours, 4 hour storage is what was optimal. Without getting into the specifics, it's a technology agnostic storage, and then so all this is possible provided you all need to build in a lot of flexibilization into the system. And there are 4 or 5 ways of building up this flexibilization. Apart from the thermal flexibilization, one need to look at also the agriculture load itself, moving towards the daytime hours, and that has been explicitly planned in case of and experienced by Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat. Many other states have actually shifted their agriculture load into daytime hours. So that's a good flexible kind of a resource that is available into the system, apart from the diurnal and seasonal storage facilities that could be brought in. One more other important thing is in terms of inter-regional and intrastate capacities, this study shows about we need to build in 140 to 150 gigawatt equivalent of additional inter-regional inter-transfer capacities. The bidirectional power flows are actually changing between the regions, and it's not that we are just talking about, the studies talk about what needs to be done, but there is also a plan in place. There is a transmission plan, the Green Energy Corridor reports, phase 1, phase 2 has extensively planned the RE zone by zone base, phase 1, phase 2 talked about 66 gigawatt in the phase 1, another 50 gigawatts in the phase 2, and we have sufficient. All this is going to have a certain cost implications, but what kind of a pressure it would have with the introduction of GNA, that the renewable generator doesn't need to think through about where you need to be actually evacuating or off-taking, where his drawal point or a consumer is located. So all this has been very well planned, thought through about by the planners, and accordingly we are going to develop this by 2030 kind of scenario that we're talking about. Another important thing about intermittent, variable, and all those names that we talk about is the operational, during the grid operations, how does the integrated operations would work? And there is also parallel action which has happened so far is through REMCs, the Renewable Energy Management Centers, well established through German funding in almost 11, all the RLDCs as well as 7-8 RE-REET states. About 11 locations REMCs are fully operational since last 4-5 years. And forecasting scheduling framework, I was party to the Forum of Regulators Technical Advisory Committee, and we developed this model FNS regulations. And with that FNS framework, many states have, almost all RE-REET states have already operationalized. In fact, 23 states got a forecasting scheduling regulations in place, and not just regulations, the procedures for implementation, energy accounting, getting the qualified coordinating agencies, QCS, which will do this forecasting scheduling, all that is already in place and the trial operations done. And last 4 years, we've got a fairly good amount of experience, so much so that now we are also trying to plan if kind of a curtailment if it is necessary, instead of undue curtailment, it can be done in a planned basis and minimized rather. So there is also another framework which is currently coming up. Here the work in progress or the challenge is to accommodate. Today we are talking about 119 gigawatt, out of which ISTS connected is hardly 35 odd gigawatts, but most of it is state connected. At the state level, the forecasting, scheduling accuracy as well as preparedness of the QCs and the states is not as much as what is desirable. We need to start tightening of those bands out here on the FNS part. So now looking at it, this is in terms of operations. So what is it in terms of for a 500 gigawatt, what is required? And there is also work in progress actions by the ministry and both MOP and MNRE. The RPO trajectory, we are aspiring to reach 43% from, that's a target which is mentioned, which also spells out storage purchase obligation targets going up to 4% by 2030. Renewable energy certificate mechanism is another instrument we in the private we had actually designed and helped CRC to implement this REC mechanism, and it is pleasured, although it has not been as much successful, but it speaks that about 5,000 megawatt plus of projects which are accredited or registered under this scheme, and this scheme is more than 10 decade, 12 decade old, travels to all the Aptel Supreme Court cases, and then still it is found its place in its and when we talk about now the certificate of origin, or you need to have a green certificate attributes. We have an operational experience of operationalizing REC mechanism. More than 96 million, that is equivalent of 96 billion of renewable electricity has been traded through or issued through this REC mechanism. Today we have got 16 million RECs as a closing thing. Another interesting thing recently that CRC has brought about is the multiplier framework for the REC. And more than the multiplier, multiplier is definitely useful. That will help in terms of evaluating different RE technologies, including, but they have talked about only the 4 specific technologies. We can try and think about the other technologies and multiplier framework as well. But what they had brought it out is now it can be traded bilaterally as well. The price bands of floor and foreground has been taken off. So that actually helps the market to look at this as a instrument which is bankable. They can sign a bilateral agreements and contracts here. I see there is a merit in actually looking at this instrument. So at this point in time, let's look at how the market or investors or the developers would be looking at the different options of offtake arrangements here. And I'll just put through, because in India we don't like to do only one way of only RPO or only competitive. We always have coexisted with preferential tariff as well as RPO as well as REC, and there are many more that is emerging out. The preferential tariff model has served us well. The initial capacity addition of out of that 119 gigawatt, almost 45-50 gigawatt plus is actually come through a preferential market model, but that may not continue for a variable renewable, but for a kind of a combinations of hybrid or project specific tariff, it's possible. Currently the regulations do allow, and one can really look at specific instances of hybrid plus storage plus all those combinations or any such instances. Captive and third party model in fact has been a backbone for support of this right from early days of 2003 with the state policy framework with concessional banking willing arrangements, and that worked well, but now it is not finding favor with the the banking regulations and banking requirements is actually tightened up for the brought down to monthly. Now the green energy open access rules is something which MOP has come out with, but that place it's an area of kind of an overlap. Why should MOP come out with green energy open access rules vis-a-vis regulators when they have got their own jurisdiction over that space? But they had said the methodology for determination of those charges should be placed with the regulators, and A4 should come out with that. We had actually supported recently A4 to come out with those GOA methodologies for calculation of various open access charges. So we do see, and in fact large C&I consumers are looking at this GOA space very closely. What it also brings about is, now the capacity target from 1 megawatt is brought down to 100 kilowatt. As far as at least the rules are concerned, we need to see really at the state level how that would actually pan out. So that's one challenge there. REC we just discussed, but there is further refining which is required. Competitive bidding is something which we started looking at since the competitive bidding first introduced initial FIT 17 rupees 91 paisa, and in fact but very quickly in solar we moved to a competitive model. Wind started seeing in 2016, and then we have so far looked at more than, and I'll see the next slide and come back to this slide. We have seen more than 100 gigawatt plus RFP bids already awarded. But of late, recently, there is a challenge about, finding a off-taker, a state's off-takers to, having a back-to-back. SECI and NTPCs have done this bidding, but the buyers, have not fully, some of these bids have not fully contracted out. And there are, reasons for that. So what the reason is that essentially now the discoms have started demanding standalone wind or standalone solar. They have started looking at the load following, the RTC tenders, the bundled products, that is something which is finding favor. So going forward, we do expect that this is hybrid RTC with storage should actually these tenders would actually is something that beneficiaries and discoms would start demanding. And the last important thing which is brought about is actually the market access for renewables. The GDAM and GTAM has been introduced by CRC, and we've got a fairly good success in terms of operations of the green products on the market. But still, that doesn't inspire a confidence for a long-term contract arrangement. So we need to find out ways and how do we actually bring in renewable onto the market. And the one starting point here is again the GNA framework, which has brought in which has simplified the market access for the renewable power as well as connectivity rules for them. So we do expect, going forward, the renewables would have a simplicity in terms of market access and contracting arrangement in place. But going forward, this, the hybrid RTC and composite RA schemes, to be able to do that, there is already also the...
Really informative, but I'm just saying 15 minutes we're done with, but please continue.
I'll just complete maybe last 5 minutes part. So there is already a hybrid policy, the bundling policy, and all those guidelines already which are there in place. So what is required, maybe I'll touch on storage, I'll not cover the offshore, we'll try and cover that in the question section here. Storage is one technology which actually can be adopted across the value chain or each segment of the business all along. So there is a vast scope for technology because kind of variable renewable that we are penetrating into the grid is going to raise the concerns for the discoms and buyers about reliability requirements and how they are going to actually meet, and that is where the resource adequacy framework which will actually emerge out. The grid code talks about that, which is currently in the draft stage of discussion, and then there is already a guidelines from the CA to that effect, and then at the state level also this compliance requirement for the resource adequacy will become important going forward. And that's where the storage would find a very important place. But the question that we need to be answering vis-a-vis storage is whether it's a generation asset class, transmission or a distribution, because it can operate at every end, and depending on that the who owns the asset, who gets the right to operate and dispatch and control that asset. There are various ways in which you can actually harness the revenue from that or value streams from that energy storage asset. In fact, this is one class of asset which can actually provide energy service, grid service, ancillary service, and a combination of all that. So while developing a policy and regulatory framework for them, we need to actually recognize all these aspects and allow the different participation model, contracting arrangements, all that is possible to be done. So I'll stop here and not try and cover the other two areas, and maybe we can take it